Okay, are we all right?
Yeah.
All right, good morning, everybody. Nice to see you all. Welcome to this month's Hexham debate. It's the last Hexham debate of the series of 2026, but we'll be back in the autumn, but I'll tell you about that later, and next year, obviously. And so the topic today, obviously, is community organising and why it's important. I think we could all talk about that quite a lot, about why it's important, especially at this moment, not just in this country, but over the pond and everywhere else. So, as usual, our speaker will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have 30 minutes for questions and discussion. So, if you're new to the Hexham debate, please mute yourself unless you're asked to speak. And if you want to ask a question, put your hand up or put your question in the chat. And then when you're called on, please unmute yourself. So I'm delighted to welcome Sarah Bryson. She's the Assistant Director North at Citizens UK and the lead organiser with Tyne and Wear Citizens, where she has been a community organiser for 10 years. Sarah trained in the Alinsky organising tradition with both Citizen UK and the Industrial Areas Foundation in the United States. In her 10 years at Citizens UK, Sarah has run campaigns on the real living wage, securing a pay rise for hundreds of thousands of low-paid workers across the region. Sarah trains hundreds of community leaders each year to lead and win campaigns, as well as supporting the development of community organisers across the north of England. So welcome, Sarah, and thank you very much. And over to you.
Thanks, Penny. Morning, everyone. It's really great to be with you all and talk about this topic of why is community organising important. Before I share why I think it's important, I thought it was worth spending a little bit of time discussing what it actually is, because community organising is one of those terms that's used a lot at the moment, but it means very different things to different people. So I thought it was worth me outlining what I think it is, so we all know what we're talking about. Simply put, community organising is a methodology, and it's one of many methodologies, but it is a distinct methodological approach that is used to bring about social justice and the common good. And the type of organising that I've practiced over the last 10 years with Citizens UK is known as broad-based organising, or BBO, which sounds like a bad smell, but stands for broad-based organising. And we're broad in two ways. We're broad in that we work on any issue or campaign. So we're probably most known for the living wage campaign, but we can campaign on any issue. It might be housing, it might be fighting for a zebra crossing, it might be wages, it could be anything. We're not limited in the scope in that way. But we're also deliberately broad in terms of who our members are, and we actively recruit and try and bring together a very diverse group of people to work on these issues. And we tend to organise within civil society, so that tends to be institutions of faith, education, and community groups. And whenever we run a campaign, people will be working with others who they wouldn't normally meet or work with in everyday life. And as Penny mentioned, this kind of work comes from the work of Saul Alinsky and originated in the United States in the 1930s. Interestingly, in times very similar to those that we find ourselves in at the moment, the Great Depression, a lot of polarization and conflict within communities. And Alinsky developed it in a place called Back of the Yards in Chicago. And it really came about because politics as they were at the time just simply wasn't working for most communities. And Alinsky believed there had to be another way of doing things, of getting things done in the community that wasn't reliant on elected politicians who were often failing those communities. And that was where this style of community organising that our practice was born. And I think that's interesting in when we look at why is it important, because it came out of necessity. It came out of trying to do things in a different way to get different results. And I think a lot of us find ourselves coming to organising for the very same reasons at the moment. So in America, if I said to anyone, I'm a community organiser, they would know what it is because it's been practiced there for such a long time. Obviously, famously during the civil rights era, so both Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks were trained in this Alinsky style method of community organising, and you can see it exercised wonderfully during the civil rights movement in terms of how they used the methodology to campaign and win change. And then Barack Obama was famously a community organizer in Chicago before he entered politics. He organized in his communities, and if you've read any of his books, he talks quite extensively about his time as a community organizer there. But here in the UK, it's probably less well known and it might mean different things. I think some people use it interchangeably to mean community development or campaigning. But it is this, like I say, this distinct method. And it was brought to the UK in the 1980s and first practiced by an organisation which is part of Citizens UK called Telco, the East London Communities Organisation. And there was a guy who was originally from the Northeast, from North Shields, called Neil Jameson, who trained in America and brought the methodology over to the UK in the 1980s. And Neil had worked in the voluntary sector, he'd worked for Save the Children, and similarly found that the way we did things just wasn't getting the results that communities needed. And he too was looking for something else that might unlock and enable change to happen. So he brought it and practiced it within East London. And that was where and how the living wage movement was born using this methodology. And it actually came out of a campaign and listening to communities around what change would they like to see. And we always ask the same question: what's putting pressure on you, your family, and your community? We never start with a campaign in mind, but start by asking people what the pressures are in their neighbourhoods. And people didn't say wages, actually. What they said was, what we would like is to spend more time with our loved ones. And the reason they weren't spending enough time with their family and their loved ones was because most of them had two, if not three jobs, because the salary of one job wasn't paying them enough to live. So people were having to have multiple jobs, which meant they had no time at all to spend with those that they cared for. So the campaign then looked at, well, what do we need to do if we're going to have enough time to spend with our loved ones? And they said, well, what if the salary of one job was enough to live on and you didn't need to take on multiple jobs? And because it was in East London, most of them were cleaners working in the financial industry, which grew up around Canary Wharf, if any of you know that part of the world. And the campaign then became, let's get HSBC Bank to pay their staff a real living wage so we only have to do one job and therefore have enough time to spend with our family and loved ones. They wrote to HSBC Bank as cleaners and asked for a meeting with Sir John Bond, who ran HSBC at the time. And unsurprisingly, they got no response. A load of cleaners writing to Sir John Bond, maybe he never even saw it, never even got to his desk, but they got no response. So they began to organise using the methodology to think about how could they get the reaction they wanted, which was a meeting with John Bond. And they did a shareholder action and they took out shares in HSBC Bank because if you're a shareholder, you can attend their annual general meeting where all of the key decision makers are in attendance. So they took £1 shares, but that was all they needed to be able to attend the meeting. And they went with their broad-based alliance of churches and not just cleaners, but others. And it was actually a priest who called the meeting to order. And now, if I did it as an organiser and called the AGM of HSBC Bank to order, I'd probably get manhandled out the building. But because it was a priest in his dog collar, people didn't react like that and allowed him the floor. And he said, I have an urgent item to add on to the agenda. And of course, they entertained that. And he said to Sir John Bond, I have your cleaner here and he would like to speak to you. So by this point, it's too late. And a cleaner called Abdul Durant had the floor. And he addressed Sir John Bond and he said to him, we walk the same corridors every day, but we live very different lives. And he said, I clean your office. Do I do a good job? And Sir John Bond said, yeah, of course you do. And he said, so why don't you pay me enough to live on? And they didn't become a living wage employer at that point, but it did get them a meeting with Sir John Bond to be able to campaign and try and get the banks accredited. And it was actually Barclays Bank that accredited first, but HSBC did eventually become a living wage employer. So it's that kind of practice that began Citizens UK, but it did start in telco. And this year we're celebrating 25 years of the Living Wage Foundation and the Living Wage campaign, which has now put millions of pounds into the pockets of low paid workers. And the way we do this, the first central principle of this style of community organising that we practice is probably surprising and sometimes can be controversial. But the first central principle is if you want change, you have to have power. Now, how we react to that is often a result of our experiences of power, which is often negative. And so a lot of people don't like talking about power or the fact that they have to consciously and deliberately build their power if they want to bring change. And I think a lot of us fail in our campaigning attempts because we rush to the issue and we rush to the campaign without diligently building our power base first. And so we never start a campaign within community organising without, first of all, thinking about power and intentionally and consciously building it. Now, the type of power that I'm talking about is obviously not power over. It isn't the type of power that comes to mind when you think of it. Because, whenever we do this in training, we'll say to people, what comes to mind when you think of a powerful person? And it'll be people like Trump or Elon Musk or somebody like that. That is not the type of power that we're advocating that people build. What we're talking about is a relational people power, a power with type of power that we have to build together with others before we can act on justice issues. Because I might be passionate about something, but if I run off and try and change it on my own, I'm not going to get very far. But if I want to win it, then I have to find others who also want to work on that issue and want to campaign with me. So the first thing we do as organisers is we build power. And obviously within Citizens UK, that's through an alliance of institutions. So Tyne Way Citizens is about 40 organisations who say, yeah, we will work with one another to have enough power, to have more power, so that we might get breakthroughs on the things that we care about. And we'll disagree on lots and lots of things, but we're willing to park that and focus on the things that we care about, that we want to see change. And that's how we build our power base in Tyne and Wear. But we also believe in the second concept of community organising after power is self-interest, because we believe no one acts unless is in their self-interest to do so. And again, it's a very emotive, controversial concept. And it doesn't mean selfishness, it doesn't mean selflessness. It means that I do this organising work because I'm a kid who grew up in a council estate in Cowgate and I experienced poverty. And that passion for wanting to eradicate poverty comes from my experience of it and comes from the fact that my family still suffer the impact of poverty. It's my self-interest to do so because it impacts me and the people I care about. And you can have things that you care about that don't necessarily impact you, but I would argue that that's not going to sustain you on a campaign because campaigning for change can be long and can be difficult. And you have to have something within you that will drive you and keep you going. So we look at self-interest and we try and understand our own self-interest and try and understand the self-interest of others. And we do that through relational one-to-one meetings. As a community organiser, we have to have at least 15 of these relational meetings a week. And I would argue it's the most radical thing that we teach, not the campaign and strategy work, but that you have to go and meet people face to face and have conversations with them. Because the way we communicate now as a society, it's online, it's on emails, it's text messages, and that doesn't build relationships. It doesn't help us build power. You have to put in the work to meet and talk with people and do it, a lot of it, if you're going to have enough of a power base to bring about change. And there's a great old African proverb which says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, you go together. And there is no shortcuts, unfortunately, to finding the others that you can go together with on social justice issues. So who builds this power? Well, in community organising, it's leaders in the communities. It's not me, the organiser. It is done through what we call a snowflake model of if we're going to have enough power to win on issues like poverty and wages, you're talking about the need for hundreds and thousands of people. If I have to have all of those relational meetings with hundreds of thousands of people, it's going to take me decades to get anywhere. But if there's 100 of us having those relational conversations, we can really do it effectively. So we work and we build the capacity of people within their community to do it for themselves and invest in putting a lot of time and energy into that. And at Citizens UK, we work through institutions. So it's organisations that join our alliance, not individuals. And again, that's because it enables larger numbers of people to participate. But also, our institutions have been there for hundreds of years and they'll be there for hundreds more. They will outlive the individuals engaged. But there are community organising approaches that work with individuals really effectively. Organisations like Acorn, individuals join and they work on issues of housing, and it's been a very effective model. So it's not to say that there's only one way of doing it, there are multiple ways of practicing it. But building leadership capacity is a central focus of the community organising methodology, and that's why we train hundreds of people every year so that there's more and more people equipped to do this. And it's often not the usual suspects. It's often not the people that you would think that would lead a campaign. In organising, there is no such thing as superheroes or super people. All of us need each other if we're going to do this. None of us have all the qualities of leadership that you would need, but collectively we do, and we all bring different things to the table. So we support and promote a collective organising model where, people might need to step forward or step back at different times, but the whole thing doesn't then collapse because it's not reliant on one individual. It's a collective group of people doing it together. So once we've built the power, then what do we do? You'd think, well, now you get into the campaigning. But no, because once you've built power, then we listen. And we never assume anything and we never start a campaign because that's just something that you care about. We always do a listening cycle, which for someone like me was very frustrating because I just wanted to dive straight into the action bit because that's the bit I love the most. But you have to listen. And it seems obvious why you listen. But it's not just to find out the issues, it's not just to find out the stories, but it's to find the people who are going to lead the campaign ultimately. So when we listen, we never do a survey because you're not building relationships or getting to know people if they fill in a survey. You have to be in conversation with them. And when we launched Tyne and Wear Citizens, we went into listening, and I knew poverty was going to become one of the key issues. Like I say, I was somebody who grew up in poverty, and I worked for decades before I became an organiser in the voluntary sector, trying to tackle poverty and failing. Child poverty rates were rising, not getting any better. So I knew it was going to come up, and I felt like I was an expert in poverty. I'd experienced it. I was often invited to speak at conferences and events about it. So why do I need to listen to people about what the issues are? Because I know. And I remember working with some secondary school students in year 10, and we were actually having a debate about whether poverty existed. And they were saying, well, food poverty doesn't exist because there's no shortage of food, there's just a shortage of money to buy it. Like, why do we call it food poverty? It's just poverty. And there was a girl called Jess in year 10, and she said, you know what would make a difference to me? It would be if I could have my change off my dinner money. And we were like, what do you mean? Because when I was a kid on free school meals, you used to get a little ticket. You'd queue up and you got given a little ticket, and then you took your little ticket to the dinner hall and you got exchanged it for a meal. But in nowadays, it's all biometric fingerprint system. So Jess goes into school and she scans her thumb, and they say you have £2.10 balance on your free school meal allowance. If she's off school on a Monday and she comes into school on a Tuesday, she scans her finger, she still has £2.10. And she was saying, where does Monday's £2.10 go? Because if I had £4.20 on a Tuesday, I could eat more food and I wouldn't need to use the food bank because I would have more food that I could access. What happens to the money? Now, I would never have thought of that as an expert on poverty because I'm not a kid on preschool meals now and it didn't work like that in my day. So the importance of listening is to understand not just the problem but the solution. So we said we'll do a meeting with the head teacher. And, I worked with the young people to do a presentation to him to ask about where this money went. And he had no idea either. Why would he? He wasn't a kid on free school meals. But he did promise to go away and find out for Jess where it went. It took him a long time, and he said it's been very complicated, but I've worked it out. We found out where it goes, and it was retained by the provider of free school meals as profit. And in this instance, it was a multinational company called Chartwells. And if you know anything about children on free school meals, you know they're more likely to be absent from school. And we worked with Northumbria University to look at how much money was lost in this way. And it was £88 million per year lost from free school meal allowances to private providers of the meals that wasn't going to children on free school meals. And it's taxpayers' money, right? We pay our tax and it's allocated by the government to the most vulnerable children to enable them to have food. And I guess this is the difference of organising and why I think it's important is we're not a service delivery, we're not a charity, we're not trying to be a stick and plaster on the problem. Our response to that is not to set up a food bank. And I understand why people do that because it's a need, people need food, we do what we can to support people. But it's not actually tackling the underlying problem. It's not actually addressing the need for it. We're just seeing more and more food banks and the need for more and more food banks rise because we're not getting rid of the root cause. We're not trying to understand the root cause and tackle it. So the campaign that the young people ran was called Just Change, which was to get their dinner money back. And, we talked a lot during that campaign that if you get justice, you don't need charity. It's very humiliating to be at the receiving end of charity, and I'm not knocking it. I've worked in the charitable sector most of my life. But we need to have just more justice and less charity in our society. And this is a way of doing it, I believe. And so the young people, they didn't get a result from Chartwells, but they did get a result from the Roman Catholic Diocese of Hexham and Newcastle. And the bishop at the time said, we can make sure kids in Catholic schools get their money back. So it was a Catholic trust who first did it. And the head teacher there was an amazing head teacher called Dame Maura Reagan. She spent £200 on changing the IT system. And in 1 year, in one of her schools, £17,000 went back to children to be able to spend on food. And they can't spend it on anything else, right? Because it's just food and drinks. It's not a cash system. But it reduces that need for things like food bank and charity to address it. But that campaign was led by those young people. So they led the campaign, they grew out of it, they learned how to change things when they don't work. And, I'm still in touch with many of them and they're flourishing and doing amazing as a result because their agency, their feeling that they could change something, that they would be listened to, massively increased. So the importance of listening and not running to a campaign too early is so important because if you don't do that, you lose that richness. We do train and support leaders on how what we call to cut an issue. So it's easy to describe the problem, but it's sometimes harder to find out what the solution is and what the campaign is therefore going to be. And we spend a lot of time training and supporting people on how to do that. We're working on access to NHS dentistry at the minute, and we're in that process of let's do research actions together. Let's go and find out what's happening around the world. And the beauty of Zoom and online work is that we can do that now. You can get the world's leading expert on dentistry in a meeting with your leaders to talk about what they think the solutions might be and help them learn how to strategize together. So we don't then write reports or hold a conference, we take public action. So that's probably the bit of organising that we're most well known for as our public actions, because we believe that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, it never will. You always get a no first, and you almost need a no to start a campaign. You ask first, and then they say no, and they go, okay, now we can run a campaign. Um, but it's always an action to get an intended reaction. So when people say to me, Sarah, will you come on this protest? We're going to march down Northumberland Street on Saturday. I usually say no, because like, what are you going to achieve, really? Walking up and down Northumberland Street when people are doing their shopping. How's that going to change the thing you want to change? Like, let's get a bit smarter. What is the reaction we want? And therefore, what is the action we need to take to get that intended reaction? So when we were doing a campaign to get a living wage at Sunderland University, for example, we wanted to get accreditation to a living wage employer on the governing body's agenda, and we couldn't get it. So the action we took was we all got dressed up. It was Christmas. We got dressed up. We had Santa Claus and we had elves, and we put Sunderland University on the naughty step for paying poverty wages. We sang rewritten Christmas carols and we took mince pies. And we got an agreement that they would discuss it in their next board meeting. So, it was very silly, it was very cold, it was very good fun, but it was to get an intended reaction. If we'd marched through the centre of Sunderland, I doubt that the Vice Chancellor would have even known that we were there. Like, it has to be more strategic than that. Um, so that's the type of public action we take. And then we evaluate and we reflect because we're learning all the time, especially at the moment with the political sands changing. We're in new territory. And if we're not reflective and constantly thinking, well, did that work? Why not? What can we do better next time? Then we weaken our ability to create change. And also being willing to get it wrong and take risks. As long as we learn from it, then we think that's okay. So for me, community organising is not charity. You don't need charity if you get justice, but it's not service delivery. People will often ring me up and say, "Oh, we'd love to do this community organising thing," and I think they think I'm going to come along and do it for them, solve all their problems. It's not that. We will come along and train you to do it so you can do it for yourself. So it's not a service delivery, it's a methodology, it's training, it's a capacity building for people to do it for themselves. It's not advocacy. Of course, advocacy has its place, but we don't ever speak for other people. If you ever come to any of our assemblies or events, you will never ever hear me speak on the stage. People are more than capable of speaking for themselves. And it's not mobilisation, it's not demonstrating on the streets, it's a action to get an intended reaction. And it's important to me, like I say, because I tried for decades to try and change the world through the voluntary sector. And not only did we not achieve the ending of poverty, but poverty rates increased. So I did a Clough Fellowship programme to take a year out to try and investigate models of change that were effective. And that was where I first came across the living wage movement and community organising. And that was what convinced me to try doing something in a different way. And I'm here 10 years later because I've won more change in those 10 years than I did in the 20 years before that. We just worked with some young people who wanted to reduce bus fares. They were saying, why is it when I'm 16 that I have to pay full fare as an adult on the bus when I'm still going to the same school? I've got a job, but I'm on the youth minimum wage of £4 an hour. The bus is costing me that just to get to and from work. And they ran an amazing campaign called Fares Fair. And we now have the Get Around for a Pound scheme, which impacts 23,000 young people across the North East. It's that kind of change that is meaningful. But I think it's crucially important for all of us as a method at this time that we're living in, because politics isn't working. We've seen that all around us recently. Poverty and inequality is massively increasing and deepening. People are angry and are losing their faith and trust in our institutions. There's growing division, hatred, and polarization. And that kind of hatred is able to get hold because people's living standards are declining and they no longer believe that voting in elections is going to solve their problems. So I really honestly believe that democracy itself is currently at risk. And the state and the market are well organised, but I think for us in civil society, we're not. And we have to do better. We have to be better at giving an alternative and putting a solution in front of people that says, you're rightly angry, but what you're angry about is not immigration. It's about lack of access to decent housing. It's about lack of access to decent wages. And it doesn't matter who you vote for, you're not going to achieve that. You have to fight for that yourself, and we'll work with you to win that if you really care enough and want to change that in your community. So I think it's more important than ever. I think it's more important than ever that we listen to people, that people are sick of being told what to do and what to think, that they want the agency to act on the issues they care about. I think it's more important than ever that people feel that they can do something and they can change something in their community if it isn't working. I also think it's crucial that we build trust across difference, that we bring people not only who look differently to one another, but who think differently to one another. I'm working at the moment with people who voted Reform and people who voted Green. And you know what? We can get on with it just fine. It's when did we lose the ability to disagree with one another and for that to be okay? But it's so important that we get better at working with people that are different from us. And crucially, I wouldn't be still doing this work if it didn't win. All of that is lovely, but if we didn't actually win the change, if I wasn't feeling it in my community, I would be looking for something else. So I think we need organising because it works and it does result in change. And I do see it as the only thing I can see at the moment, which is an alternative to the politics of hatred and division. So we want to develop leaders and their capacity in their communities, strengthen our institutions so that civil society is better able to respond to crises, just like we did during COVID. And let's face it, there's going to be many more crises hitting us down the road, and our institutions need to be equipped to deal with that. We build trust across difference, and we win change and get that justice that we so desperately need at the moment. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was well, fascinating and totally inspiring. And the fact that it's on our doorstep and working. So obviously Hexham Debates is based in Hexham, so there might be some questions about how we transfer the model over here because things need doing in all communities. Just the practical thing is that I'm just curious to know how Citizens UK is funded.
Yeah, it's a really important question. So we don't take state funding for obvious reasons, because the minute you take money from an agency, then your ability to campaign on the issues is then curtailed. So we have what we call hard and soft funding, and our hard money is our membership dues. So we're organising people, but we're organising our resources too. So when people join the Alliance of Tyne and Wear Citizens, they pay money. And they aren't paying it to me, they're paying it to themselves because they're collectively pooling their resources to be able to campaign on whatever issue they want to campaign on. Now, obviously, there's a scale of what people pay depending on the size of the institution. People like Newcastle University and the Catholic Diocese are strategic partners and they pay significantly more. And then small voluntary sector organisations like Citizens Advice Newcastle, they'll pay about £800 a year to join. So it varies. And then we do sometimes get grant funding. If, like when we did the free school meal campaign, Joseph Rowntree Foundation gave us a grant, but it was one, we'll only accept a grant once a campaign has already started and it meets what we want to do. We wouldn't take a grant if that was going to shift like what we focused on. We wouldn't take funding and say, okay, now we've got to do a campaign on this because we've got this money. It would have to be the other way around. So how we're funded is very important to keep us free and able to work on what any issue we care about.
That's great. Thank you very much. Can I just slip another question in? Because um, community organizing organizers were part of the Corbyn campaign. And so, what you've described has been replicated in other formats. So I'm interested that you work across the political spectrum, but it's used a lot in America on the left, isn't it? But exactly the same model, but to enact presumably what they believe to be socialist principles.
Like the Alinsky style organising is non-partisan because you're trying to influence power and it doesn't matter who's in charge, the way you do it is the same. The way you hold them accountable, it doesn't matter what their political persuasions are. And there's a lot of like maxims in organising, like no permanent friends, no permanent allies. You might have somebody who is politically, you think, very aligned, but actually won't do the thing that you're trying to get them to do. So you kind of try and be a bit more pragmatic about it in terms of this is the target and this is the ask. They might be your ally 1 minute, but they're not the next. Um, but what we have begun to see in different places is political arms of organising organisations where they've set up a separate entity where people might stand for election themselves or might campaign and use organising within elections. And what we saw with the Corbyn experiment, I guess, was after Ed Miliband lost the election, he went and did citizens training, and some of the organisers went to work with them to see if they could set up community organising within the Labour Party. I could never quite get my head around it because What if, it was a Labour council that you were campaigning on? Like, how would that work? But, maybe it did work in some ways, maybe it didn't work in others. I think the model would have to be adapted to be more political. But there are people that ask me questions all the time, like, would you never stand an election, or would you never support leaders in the community to stand for election? We're a charity, so we have to abide by Charity Commission laws. We have to be non-partisan. But I think there are people interested in exploring maybe a community interest company that could use organiser methodology in a more overtly political way.
Very interesting. Thank you. Yeah, great. Um, open to the floor, please. I'm sure that Jim has got a question. Jim always has a question. Do you want to, have you got a question, Jim? Otherwise, it's just going to be me and Sarah. Oh, are you there,
I'm
Jim?
not sure. I'll just.
Or an observation?
I'm not actually. Well, an observation perhaps rather than a precise question in relation to community organising. But for example, I'm concerned at the publicity and the support for example, developing the defence industry against welfare. And even traditional Labour supporters in the press, George Robertson in particular, just saying that he used the example of child benefit should have been retained at two children at the expense of the defence industry, and find that problematic. But again, the reality is that part of that defence aspect, as you know, is in the west end of Newcastle, because the factory is actually owned by the Israeli government. And how do we address issues like people who are actually employed there for a living in that, and how do we discuss alternative employment, or at least have it on the agenda? So I'm not actually sure as to where community organising might touch that, but I think it's a current issue, certainly in terms of expenditure. And I'm a Glaswegian, as you know, by origin, and the Prime Minister standing in Govan, which is a relatively poor area, just saying how good it is, to build 4 battleships, for the Norwegian government. This will deal with poverty. So you see my complex question. I'm not sure about community organising, but if there's an issue, that's one that does actually bother me at the present time.
Yeah, I think a lot of the things that we all care about seem like overwhelming,
Yeah.
insurmountable problems, and they're huge. And it always starts like that, where we're like, what are the things we want to work on? Poverty, racism, mental health. And you're like, wow, how are we
Mm,
ever going to focus in enough to be able to win? And I think that's the trick of the organizing methodologies. You start with a big complex problem, but we never go to power with a big problem.
mm,
Because if you go and say, we want to talk to you about this, you're going to leave the meeting without anything concrete. You have to work out, what is it we are asking for? What is it that would make a difference before you go to power? So I think it's like working out within all that, what would the ask be? And we saw it recently, didn't we, with the two-child limit? You
mm,
can see something like that, you think, we're never going to get that, we're never going to win that. But
mm,
again, it's working out that self-interest piece. What is the self-interest of the government to get rid of the two-child limit? And more often than not, it's like reputational damage. We work with the press a lot as a strategic tool to embarrass people to do the right thing. But really, it's working out, how can you make it so that it's impossible for them not to do this thing? At one point, we would have said they were never going to get rid of it, but look, they did. And there was
mm,
a great campaign ran by End Child Poverty and others to make sure that that got over the line. So I would say that it is possible to community organising on a big complex issue like that, but you've got to kind of do the work to work out what the ask is, what the self-interest is, in order to get it over the line. Um,
mm,
and it's an assessment, right? You have to think, well, we don't think
mm,
that's winnable at the moment. And you don't always want to start a campaign that you think is just going to become entrenched for decades and never get you
mm,
anywhere. So it's working out what the little wins might be along the way that
mm,
would be a step towards that.
mm, mm. So I think, I mean, citizens in the northeast and to anywhere citizens that I think have been part of the organisation that has resulted in, I think, our regional authority being the only regional authority in the country that has child poverty on the agenda, which is unbelievable. So in some ways, the community organising has actually touched and been part of that machinery that has resulted in that. But I'm not actually sure whether people across the region appreciate that we're the only place that has that on the agenda, which is a great achievement, really, given the kind of the national political kind of climate. But I'm sure there's other questions in the room, so look for them.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. Very interesting question. I think this is such an interesting subject because obviously the notion of justice that is the absolute cornerstone of that, and the British public are famed for not liking things that aren't fair, but obviously don't know how to mobilise that's urge or principle really. Peter, sitting next to me, has a question, and it's around direct action. So I was wondering, so you've talked about campaigning, and presumably within that is lobbying and working out what your ask is. But do you use, direct action, whatever that might be? Maybe, organising a march, or I don't know. Is that part of the suite of actions that you might consider?
Yeah, so we very rarely march, but we do what we call public actions. So when something becomes stuck, we'll think, right, we need to take action. And what might that look like to get the intended reaction? And an example of that was we were campaigning on the increase in Islamophobia after the Brexit vote. And it was largely coming from Muslim women across the West End of Newcastle who were seeing a massive rise in physical and verbal abuse on the streets. And when we tried to break it down in terms of what would our ask be, they were saying that incidents were increasingly happening on public transport, supermarkets, and GP surgeries, which were public places, and everyone had a right to safety in those spaces. And they did a lot of listening, and the majority of the incidents that were reported were on public transport, so that became the target. And Nexus became the target because they have a convening power with the other travel operators. And we worked out that Nexus didn't have a hate crime policy. So it was no surprise that people weren't getting a response off drivers when they were reporting it because there was no policy in place. So our ask became, will you work with us to develop a hate crime policy on public transport so that if incidents of hate crime do occur, it's dealt with appropriately? And they'd said yes, and it was in draft form for about 18 months. We were like, this is never going to come out. So this is the point where you get to action. You're like, we're going to have to now take a public action, otherwise this is never going to happen. So you're increasing the pressure on it to make it happen. And we thought about what that action might be and decided that well, it wasn't me, but it was the women that were leading the campaign. We're like, why don't we take from the women's movement the Reclaim the Night and reclaim the metro? We take an action to reclaim the metro. We'll ask everyone to wear a hijab and travel on public transport to see what it's like if you're a visibly Muslim person traveling on public transport. And we get loads of press to it. So we had the BBC, Time Teas, Al Jazeera covering the action. And we went to Nexus and said, this is what we're doing. We're going to be reclaiming the metro on Saturday. The press are going to be there. And the first thing they're going to ask is, what is your response? What are you doing about it? So you either publish the thing or you don't. That's up to you. I mean, they weren't very happy. I'm not very popular. They weren't very happy with us. But lo and behold, they published it on the Wednesday and the action was on the Saturday. So we still went ahead with the action. Sometimes the threat of action is all you need. You don't always have to carry it out. But we felt it was important to still carry it out because it got in the press. It underlined the commitment. We actually got them on in the monument and we gave them garlands of flowers and chocolates because they did the right thing. We were like, you're wonderful people with this hate crime policy. This is great. And we travelled on the metro to the Whitley Bay to have fish and chips because that's the British thing to do. And we just engaged with people on the metro. This is why we're here. This is what we're doing. We gave out roses to people. So it's very different to a protest. We could have had a march, but it wouldn't have had the same reaction. So we always start with what is the reaction we want and what action do we need to take to get it. We don't just take action for the sake of it. which I think it makes us very distinct to some of the mobilising efforts, which are really important, don't get me wrong, but are very, very different. So yeah, that's the type of action that we take.
Right, very interesting. That's a great story. And then did you do some follow-up work to see whether people were experiencing less?
Yeah,
Um,
the follow-up work was like training
mm,
for drivers to understand it and deal with it appropriately. But
mm,
obviously, we're talking about it again now because we're seeing a rise in that kind of racism again. And interestingly, it's also beginning to peak on public transport again. And I think there's lots of reasons for why that is because you're kind of in this contained environment, and people are not emboldened again and have the confidence again to be racist in a public way. And we're thinking at the moment and talking about what else do we need in place. And it's not always going to end racism, but I think it's trying to get back to that place where people don't think it's okay to do it in public and it becomes frowned upon again. I feel like when I was a kid growing up in the West End of Newcastle, in the 80s, the NF were very active and people did behave like that. And then we went through a period in the 90s where it was just unacceptable. And if you
mm,
behaved like that in public, people would say, "What's the matter with you?" And now we're back to how it was in the 80s where
mm.
it is acceptable again. And we're trying to look for what other levers to make that be unacceptable again. And we're still in that process of cutting the issue and working out our ask in relation
Mm.
to that. So watch this space.
Yeah, very good. It's very interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of this is around about challenging power and organizations and strategies and systems, but you're starting at looking people in the eye, and that's where it needs to start, isn't it? That we're all human beings, and at some level, we can connect with people, whoever they are, even if they're being racists on the bus. So you need the policies and you need the driver, but you also need the people to say that's not right. Yeah.
And it's the thing that happens in the process of that as well, right? Because when we were doing the campaign, I was working with a group of Quaker women who said
Mm,
to me, I feel a bit uncomfortable campaigning for women to be able to wear a headscarf. Like, aren't there campaigns in other parts of the world for women not to have to wear a headscarf? Like, aren't people like forced into it? And I said, well, have you spoken to any of the Muslim women? I was like, I really encourage you to go and have that conversation. They're very open for anyone to ask questions because these are some of the strongest women I've ever worked with in my life. And the thought of anyone making them do anything is like laughable. And so they got to know one another and got to understand each other in a way that they never would in everyday life. And then when we were on the Reclaim the Metro action, there were these Quaker women in their hijabs
mm,
alongside them, and so they'd changed in the process. And I think
mm.
that's so important. As part of the campaign, we were like, who else suffers hate crime on public transport? The LGBTQ community, the disabled community. Like, we have to work with others who are also experiencing this pain because it's in all of our interests to do that. So, we had like the imam sitting next to an openly gay leader of a charity having dinner because like we're all trying to win this thing for all of our benefit. And I don't see anywhere else in public life where you can bring diverse people together like that to better understand each other, which in turn makes our communities safer because you hold
Mm.
those relationships and you can call on one another when things get difficult. And it's only through the process of working together that we can really achieve that.
Yes, very good. Very good. So, it's 10 to. Has anybody got a secret question that they're dying to ask? Otherwise, I will just carry on. It's very interesting. I'm having a great time. Thank you. Okay, I shall carry on. What campaigns are you involved in currently, Sarah? And have you got one that's coming up, or just what's happening now?
Yeah, so it's quite cyclical how we work, and we go through a listening period, then an action period, then back into listening. So we've just come out of a listening period, and we have what we call a delegates assembly. And I'll try and get some pictures up just to show you, so it brings it to life more than me talking about it. Where our members come together to discern and decide what we're going to campaign on and work on. And I'll hopefully be able to get up some of the pictures of it. Um, Ignore. Oh, this is a picture from the Reclaim the Metro action of us at Whitley Bay in our headscarves. Um, oh, these are the delegates. These are pictures from a delegates assembly. So this is how we decide what we're going to campaign on. So people sit at their institutional tables, they share their stories, they pitch why we should work on certain issues, and then everyone gets a vote on what we're going to work on. And at the minute, we voted to work on access to NHS dentistry because people are being asked to pay monthly subscriptions to keep their place with the NHS dentist. We're campaigning on community safety, which is very broad and includes rise in racism, community tension, flags going up, things like that. But also the need for zebra crossings, very broad. And then the third one is special educational needs and youth provision. So we're at the point where we've decided those are the three areas of focus, but they're currently working on cutting the issue and working out what their asks are. These are the young people from the free school meal campaign that I mentioned. That's them making a little video in their school of you see the big businessman at the till stealing their dinner money. That's one of the teachers dressed up with his top hat and briefcase. Yeah, this is the Reclaim the Metro action. And they made those jumpers. It said, "Hi, I'm just another being," and gave out the roses. This is the bus fare action to get the reduced bus fares for young people. And the young people are wearing their parents' um, clothes to show how silly it is that they're being treated as adults when they're still children. So they went to the meeting all dressed up in their parents' scrubs and things. This is Sunderland University when we put them on the naughty step for paying poverty wages. Can see Santa there. This is a Catholic priest in the middle dressed as a dog. This was a campaign to redevelop Scots Park in North Tyneside. And we got a letter from the then Mayor of North Tyneside who said they couldn't put swings on the swings because dogs had eaten them. So if you see in the top right, there's the frame of the swing, but there's no swings on them. So the Catholic priest dressed up as a dog to pretending to eat the swings so that we could get it in the press and embarrass them basically. And then lo and behold, there we go. There's our swings that we won. And these are like some of our assemblies. So we tend to do things in very, very large numbers because it's a show of our power, and we get the politicians on the stage and ask them to commit to things. This is the bus. This is the journey of the bus campaign. The young people meeting with Arriva. You know, it's led by them. We don't lead it at all. And we did sing songs outside, and we worked with climate activists. Some of the older people in the picture are some of the climate campaigners who worked with them and supported them. And this was what they won, get around for a pound. They had a big celebration in the sixth form common room where they got all the decision makers who'd helped them. Um, yeah, I'm just looking for the pictures really. This is all our meetings look like this. There's always millions of people. And this is some of the training that we've got coming up. If anyone's interested, I can share it with you. We've obviously had two already, but North Tyneside and Durham later on in the year.
That's great. Thank you, Sarah. Um, is there any training happening in Northumberland?
Not at the moment, but we could certainly set it up if there was enough interest.
Right. We've just had a big meeting. Well, we're about to have a big meeting at the community centre that came out of the national climate. Um, what do I want to say? Emergency. I was going to say disaster. The national climate emergency showing the film that was shown in the Abbey, and there were over 200 people there. So there's an appetite for well, obviously raising the subject, which we do widely. And I'm aware that we only have, we have 12,000 people in Hexham, and so in terms of mass, we're quite small. And I can see why the northeast and Tyne and Wear is your geographical area. So are there models that work on a smaller level, or is it just that we apply the principles to wherever we are?
Yeah, exactly that. You apply the principles. It's obviously based on power, so as long as there's enough people in a hyper-local area, it still can apply. And I did get a message from Faith Lydiard, who
Mm.
said that she couldn't make today, but that she's super keen on doing a Tyndale Citizens, some work there. So if anyone else was interested, she'd be
Mm.
willing to work with others to get something off the ground. But we could certainly do a training in that area,
Yeah,
and then see where it went from there. I'd definitely be up
great.
for that.
Excellent. So I'll be in touch. I'll get in touch with you and see what we need to have done before that happens. But that would be great. Well, that is just fascinating. I must say, I've been aware of the organisation for a long time, but living here and not living there. But I'm just really interested because I'm been in the Labour Party for a long time, and it's interesting how they are trying to apply that model, how it applies in America. But at the core of whatever it is that people are doing, it's about tackling injustice and changing the things that you can change. And I have a sense that a lot of people are waiting for permission to do things, and there's no framework for that permission to mean anything. So I can't go around giving people permission to do things, but there's somehow, because of the total imbalance in power in terms of people's lives, the gig economy, that people don't know where their agency resides is sometimes quite difficult for people to recognize. But we can all do so much in so many different ways, and this is a really, really fantastic model for change. Thank you so much. I'll be in touch. I think we might be hearing from you and your organisation again. So, Kev, thank you very much for telling us about it. Can I just, before we wrap up and before we applaud Sarah, can I just say that this is the last one for the year. Tyndale Transformed traditionally does some face-to-face meetings that look at the regional and local implications of subjects that might have been talked about on the Hexham debates. Because of various reasons, none of them terminal, but just a bit difficult, we've decided to postpone our program till the autumn. So we will let you know if you're local to Hexham. We will let you know when they're on. I'm very keen that we actually build on this one in particular and bring organisations together and to network, because it's a very active place in terms of change, but I think sometimes it's quite disparate. But we'll let you know about that. We'd like to thank you for your continuing support. But I think we've written to you before about the fact that we do have some costs. I know when it was face to face with the Hexham debates, the costs were quite high because we had to pay, well, we did, we didn't have to, but we paid the expenses for speakers who sometimes were coming from great distances. But we do have some running costs. So we've posted in the chat our bank details. If anybody feels able to make a small contribution, then that would be gratefully received. So I'm signing us out now till next year, although you will hear from us before then. So it just leaves me to thank Sarah very much for absolutely fascinating and really useful and timely and encouraging and exciting talk. Now is the time for us to start acting if we're not acting already. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thanks so much. It was great being with you all.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.